Cellular reactions to injury. At the end of this chapter, students should learn what is hyperplasia, hypertrophy, atrophy, and metaplasia and list some of their causes. They should know the differences between reversible and irreversible forms of cell injury, and they should describe the mechanism of necrosis. At last, they should describe the various types of necrosis and know some of the causes. So, let us see what is the cell injury. The cell injury underlies all diseases. So, to understand the diseases, one has to start by knowing what cell injury is. When a cell is exposed to the injurious agent, that is the causes of a disease discussed in the chapter 1, the possible outcomes are the cell may adapt to the situation or they may acquire a reversible injury. They may obtain a irreversible injury and may die. The cell may die via one of the two ways, either by necrosis or apoptosis. Which of these outcomes occur depends on both the injurious agent on cell factors. In other words, the result depends on the type, severity and the duration of the injury and on the type of the cell. This chapter covers the types of cellular adaptation, reversible cell injury and the cell death in that order. While speaking about the types of cellular adaptation, the types of cellular adaptation include hypertrophy, atrophy, hyperplasia and metaplasia. Hypertrophy, this is increase in the size of cell. Increased workload leads to the increased protein synthesis and increased size and increased number of intracellular organelle, which in turn leads to the increased cell size. The increased cell size leads to the increased size of the organ. For example, enlargement of the left ventricle in the hypertensive heart disease, increase in the skeletal muscle during the sternus exercise. While speaking about the hyperplasia, this is the increase in the number of cells. It can lead to the increase in the size of organ. It is usually caused by hormonal stimulation. It can be physiological as enlargement of breast during the pregnancy, or it can be pathological as in the endometrial hyperplasia. While speaking about the atrophy, this is the third type of cell adaptation. This is a decrease in the size of cell. This can lead to the decreased size of an organ. The atrophic cell shows the autophagic vacuoles which contain the cellular debris from the degraded organelles. The atrophy can be caused by disuse, undernutrition and decreased endocrine stimulation, denervation and old age. Next we can see about the metaplasia. This is a replacement of one differentiated tissue by another differentiated tissue. There are different types of metaplasia. Examples include squamous metaplasia. This is the replacement of another type of epithelium by the squamous epithelium. For example, the columnar epithelium of the bronchus can be replaced by the squamous epithelium in the cigarette smokers. While speaking about the osseous metaplasia, this replacement of a connective tissue by a bone, for example at the site of injury. Reversible cellular changes and the accumulation. Even though there are many different kinds of reversible cellular changes and accumulation, here we only mention the fatty changes and the accumulation of pigments. The fatty changes, this is the accumulation of triglyceride inside the parenchymal cell. It is caused by the imbalance between the uptake, utilization and the secretion of fat. Fatty change is usually seen in the liver, heart or kidney. The fatty liver may be caused by alcohol, diabetes mellitus, malnutrition, obesity and poisoning. This etiology causes the accumulation of fat in the epidocytes by the following mechanism, that is increased uptake of triglycerides into the parenchymal cells, decreased use of fat by the cell, overproduction of fat in the cell, decreased secretion of fat from the cell. While speaking about the accumulation of pigments, pigments can be exogenous or endogenous. Endogenous pigments include melanin, bilirubin, hemosiderin and the lipofuscin. Exogenous pigments include carbon. These pigments can accumulate inside cell in the different situation. The first one is the melanin. Melanin is a brownish black pigment produced by melanocyte found in the skin. Increased melanin pigmentation is caused by sun tanning and the certain diseases, nevus or the malignant melanoma. Decreased melanin pigmentation is seen in albinism and vitiligo. The next one is bilirubin. This is a yellowish pigment mainly produced during the degradation of the hemoglobin. Excess accumulation of a bilirubin causes a yellowish discoloration of the sclera, mucosa, and the internal organs. Such a yellowish discoloration is called the jaundice. Jaundice is most often caused by hemolytic anemia. The first one is a hemolytic anemia. This is characterized by the increased destruction of the red blood cell. Biliary obstruction. This is the obstruction of the intrahepatic or the extrahepatic bile ducts. It can be caused by gallstone. Hepatocellular disease. This is associated with failure of conjugation of a bilirubin. Hemosiderin. This is an iron-containing pigment derived from ferritin. It appears in tissues as golden brown amorphous aggregates and is identified by its staining reaction blue color with the Prussian blue dye. Hemosiderin exists normally in the small amount within the tissue macrophage of the bone marrow, liver and spleen as a physiologic iron stores. It accumulates in tissues in excess amount in the certain diseases. This excess accumulation is divided into two types. One is hemosiderosis. When accumulation of a hemosiderin is primarily within tissue macrophage and is not associated with the tissue damage, it is called hemosiderosis. Hemochromatosis, when there is more extensive accumulation of a hemosiderin, often within the parenchymal cell, which leads to the tissue damage, scarring and organ dysfunction, it is called hemochromatosis. Cell death. Cells can die via one of the following two ways. One is the necrosis and another one is apoptosis. Necrosis. In necrosis, excess fluid enters the cell, swells it, ruptures it, membrane which kills it. After the cell has died, intracellular degradative reaction occur within the living organism. Necrosis does not occur in the dead organism. In dead organism, autolysis and hydrolysis takes place. Necrosis occurs by the following mechanism: hypoxia, free radical induced cell injury, cell membrane damage, increased intracellular calcium level. Hypoxia. This is a decreased oxygen supply to tissues. It can be caused by ischemia. This is decreased blood flow to or from an organ. Ischemia can be caused by obstruction of the arterial blood flow. The most common cause are by decreased perfusion of a tissue by oxygen carrying blood, as occurs in the cardiac failure, hypertension and shock. Anemia. This is the reduction in the number of oxygen carrying red blood cell. Carbon monoxide poisoning. CO decreases the oxygen capacity of a red blood cell by chemical alteration of the hemoglobin. Poor oxygenation of the blood due to the pulmonary disease. The cell injury that results following hypoxia can be divided into early and late stages. The first one is early reversible stages of hypoxic cell injury. At this stage, hypoxia results in the decreased oxidative phosphorylation and ATP synthesis. Decreased ATP leads to the failure of a cell membrane NAK plus pump, which leads to the increased intracellular sodium and water, which causes the cellular and the organelle swelling. Cellular swelling is characterized by the presence of large vacuoles in the cytoplasm. The endoplasmic reticulum also swells here. The mitochondria show yellow amplitude swelling. All of the above changes are reversible if the hypoxia is corrected. And the next one is the disaggregation of a ribosome and the failure of the protein synthesis also occurs here. In case of late, irreversible stages of hypoxic cell injury, this is caused by severe or prolonged injury, caused by massive calcium influx and very low pH, which leads to the activation of enzyme which damage to the cell membrane and the organelle membrane. Irreversible damage to the mitochondria, cell membrane and the nucleus mark the point of no return for the cell. That is, after this stage, the cell is destined to die. While speaking about the release of aspartate aminotransferase, retained phosphokinase, lactate dehydrogenase into the blood is an important indicator of the irreversible injury to the heart muscle following the myocardial infarction. Free radical induced injury. Free radical, this is the any molecule with single unpaired electron in the outer orbital. Examples include superoxide and the hydroxyl radical. Free radicals are formed by normal metabolism, oxygen, toxicity, ionizing radiation and the drugs and chemicals and the reperfusion injury. They are degraded by the spontaneous decay intracellular enzymes such as glutathione peroxidase catalase, and the superoxide dismutase, and the endogenous substances such as cellular plasmin or the transferrin. When the production of the free radicals exceeds the degradation, the excess free radicals causes the membrane pump damage, ATP depletion, DNA damage. This can cause the cell injury and the cell death, cell membrane damage. Direct cell membrane damage, as in the extremes of temperature toxins or the viruses, or the indirect cell membrane damage, as in the case of hypoxia, can lead to the cell death by disrupting the homeostasis of the cell. Increased intracellular calcium level is a common pathway via which the different types of cell injury operate. For example, the cell membrane damage leads to the increased intracellular calcium level. The increased cytosolic calcium in turn activates the enzyme in the presence of low pH. The activated enzymes will degrade the cellular organelles. Types of necrosis include coagulative necrosis, liquefactive necrosis, fat necrosis, caseous necrosis, and the gangrenous necrosis. Coagulative necrosis. The most often results from the sudden interruption of the blood supply to the organ, especially to the heart. It is, in the early stages, characterized by the general preservation of a tissue architecture. It is marked by the following nuclear changes: phimosis, which in turn chromatin clumping and shrinking with the increased base of layer. Karyolysis, this is a fragmentation of a chromatin and the karyolysis, that is the fading of the chromatin material. Liquefactive necrosis, this is characterized by the digestion of a tissues. It shows the softening and the liquefaction of a tissue. It is characteristically results from the ischemic injury to the CNS. It also occurs in the suppurative infection characterized by the formation of pus. Liquefactive necrosis, this is characterized by the digestion of a tissue. It shows softening and the liquefaction of a tissue. It characteristically results from the ischemic injury to the CNS. It also occurs in the suppurative infection characterized by the formation of pus. Fat necrosis, it can be caused by the trauma to tissue with high fat content such as the breast, or it can also be caused by the acute hemorrhagic pancreatitis, in which the pancreatic enzymes diffuse into the inflamed pancreatic tissues and digest it. The fatty acid released from the digestion form the calcium salt, that is the soap formation or the dystrophic calcification. In addition, the elastase enzyme digests the blood vessel and causes the hemorrhage inside the pancreas, hence the name hemorrhagic pancreatitis. While speaking about the caseous necrosis, this has a cheese-like caseous white appearance to the naked eye, and it appears as an amorphous eosinophilic material on the microscopic examination. Caseous necrosis is typical of the tuberculosis. While speaking about the gangrenous necrosis, this is due to the vascular occlusion, or most often affects the lower extremities and the bowel. It is caused wet gangrene. It is called the wet gangrene if it is complicated by the bacterial infection, which leads to the superimposed liquefactive necrosis, whereas it is called dry gangrene if there is only coagulative necrosis without the liquefactive necrosis. Necrosis can be followed by the release of intracellular enzymes into the blood, inflammation, or the dystrophic calcification. Inflammation will be discussed in the next chapter. While speaking about the apoptosis, the second type of death in the cells, this is the death of single cell within a cluster of other cells. Note that necrosis causes the death of cluster of cells. In apoptosis, the cell shows the shrinkage and increased astrophilic staining of the cell. This is followed by the fragmentation of a cell. These fragments are called apoptotic bodies. Apoptosis usually occurs as a physiologic process for the removal of cell during the embryogenesis, menstruation, etc. It can also be seen in the pathological conditions caused by the mild injurious agent. Apoptosis is not followed by the inflammation or the calcification. The above mentioned features distinguish the apoptosis from the necrosis. Pathologic classification. This is divided into two types. One is metastatic calcification. This is caused by hypercalcemia resulting from the hyperparathyroidism, milk alkali syndrome, sarcoidosis, etc. Dystrophic calcification. This occurs in previously damaged tissue such as areas of old trauma, tuberculosis lesions, scarred heart valves, and atherosclerotic lesions. Unlike metastatic calcification, it is not caused by hypercalcemia. Typically, the serum calcium level is normal.